Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to discuss in this section is clocks, facial scars, family and kinship, and a people who just might be the Texans of Africa. We're going to look at mid-20th century cultural anthropology, these sort of structure-function guys that come in the wake of Bronislaw Malinowski. And in particular, in this lecture, we're going to look at that fellow on the lower left, Edwards Evan Evans Pritchard, and the people he studied in Central Africa, the Nuer. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head, so put that in your notes to serve as a table of contents for the information that's about to follow, because that information is going to address that question right up above my head. Why are the tribes and the nations of the world different, and how have the present differences developed? This is, of course, the mission given to cultural anthropology by Franz Boas, more than 100 years ago. Now, I'm going to amend this. I'm going to update Boas's question just a little bit. Instead of saying tribes and nations, I'm just going to say cultures. So for the remainder of this course, the question is going to be, why are the cultures of the world different, and how have those present differences developed? Now, Franz Boas kind of viewed the way to answer that question as observing a culture, describing the culture, and then offering an interpretation of the culture based on, psychology or philosophy. Malinowski said, no, that doesn't work, because psychology and philosophy may not be applicable to non-Western people. What Malinowski said is you should look at the cultural practices, the cultural structures that a given people are using, and how those structures function, how they fulfill specific needs. Because in the Trobriand Islands, Malinowski showed how cultural practices serve the needs of the individuals. The Trobriand Islanders build and maintain the Kula ring because it serves a function. The Trobriand family is structured in a certain way because it fulfills a need. Even cricket, the thing we talked about before, cricket serves as a surrogate warfare between the different islands so that they don't actually go to war. They just play cricket. So Malinowski showed how cultural practices serve the needs of the individuals of any given population. And you don't need to quote Nietzsche. You don't need to cite Freud. The Trobriand Islanders like the Kula ring because it functions to serve their needs. So this is how Malinowski kind of viewed culture as working. He viewed culture as a clock, working like a clockwork. How you have different cultural institutions, different cultural practices or structures, and they fulfill a function. Each of these different practices or institutions or structures fits with the others like the gears in a clock, and they all work together to do whatever the people need them to do. So for Malinowski, people continue to build, or they adopt cultural structures because they serve the needs of that culture. Such institutions or structures or functions or whatever are generally useful for the people who practice them. And once a cultural structure no longer fulfills this function, the people abandon it. They just quit using it. Now, regardless of how bizarre or strange a practice might be, such structures serve a function. That's what Malinowski said you should do. There's Malinowski right up above my head. He says, if you look at something that to you looks utterly strange, he says, no, look at what function that practice is serving. And we're going to look at a pretty extreme one right here. We're going to look at when people slice their face with razor blades. Now, Malinowski's approach dominated mid-20th century anthropology. It continues down to the present day, even though it's a minority of the field. But Malinowski's approach led to what is pretty much the golden age of cultural anthropology, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, when all of these people sort of fanned out across the world and proceeded to practice not Franz Boas's approach to studying culture, but for the most part, Bronislaw Malinowski's. And what was Malinowski's approach? That you study a culture's institutions for the function they serve in any given population. It is specifically a scientific and objective approach in studying culture. It studies how the structures of a culture function, like what do they do, and like what does it do. And this is how Malinowski proposes to answer that question, posed by Franz Boas. Why are the cultures of the world different, and how have the present differences developed? And it is, of course, because different cultures have different needs and build different cultural structures to fulfill those needs. And specifically, we're going to look at how three people applied Malinowski's approach in vastly different parts of the world. Edwards Evan Evans Pritchard, that's him on the left. Claude Lévi-Strauss, that's him in the center. And right above my head, Napoleon Shannon. And how they studied the Nuer of Central Africa, how his ideas were applied to the Kachin of Southeast Asia, and of course, the Native Americans of Amazonia with Napoleon Shannon. Now, as we move through these three case studies, I want you to keep in mind Thomas Hobbes. And you, of course, remember the central argument of Thomas Hobbes. He had two main points. One, which is that people are inherently sinful, and that the natural human state of nature is one that is brutal, savage, and short. And it's like nature. Everyone is involved in a war of all against all, and people are awful and just hurt and kill each other all the time. And two, the solution to this problem of human violence is the Leviathan, the state. And the power and terror of the state is going to basically force people to be good. People are not inherently good. Keep that in mind as we move through these three different cultures in Africa, Asia, and South America, respectively. Do they support Hobbes' argument? Do they refute Hobbes' argument? Or do they modify Hobbes' argument? Was Hobbes right or was Hobbes wrong when we look at different cultural functions, different cultural structures across the world? Now, we're going to start with Africa. We're going to start with Edwards Evan Evans Pritchard, 1902 to 1973. He was a British anthropologist who spent his career in sort of north central Africa, studying a highly unusual people who live there called the Nuer. And specifically, he was looking at their political and social institutions, describing how these cultural structures function to meet their needs. This is, of course, pure Malinowski. There's not a lick of Franz Boas in this. There is one of his more famous books, simply called The Nuer, a description of the modes of livelihood and political institutions of a Nilotic people. Institutions, you see, when Margaret Mead wrote Coming of Age in Samoa, she put, it's a psychological study. That's a classic Boasian approach. But when, Evans Pritchard is writing about political institutions, that's pure Bronislaw Malinowski. It made his Central European heart beat a little faster. Now, who are the Nuer? Those are the Nuer, the people with those very distinct facial scars. Now, the Nuer are a sizable coalition of tribes that have historically been remarkably successful at maintaining and defending their way of life in north central Africa. They are very close-knit. They're a group of people that have a lot of solidarity among them. And they're very distinct because they practice a type of facial scarification called gar, G-A-A-R. Gar, it's right there. The pattern of gar, the pattern of the scarification, the lines and the dots on your face, indicates what lineage and clan among the Nuer you belong to. So if you are in North Central Africa and you see someone, across the market who has this facial scarification, you can see the gar and immediately you know that A, they're Nuer. And if you know the pattern of the gar, you know exactly what family, lineage, and clan that individual belongs to. And that's very important as we describe their unusual kinship structure in just a tick. Now, the Nuer live in a very rough part of Africa. They live in that part of Africa. That's what the Nuer homeland looks like there on the upper left. The Nuer live in an area of Africa called the Sahel. The Sahel is a sort of semi-arid mix of savanna, rocky deserts, and scrub forests just south of the Sahara Desert. If you look at the map right up above my head, it's that sort of orange-yellow band that stretches just south of the Sahara Desert across the width of Africa. And the Sahel is a very hard land. It has these very mercurial weather patterns that are very difficult to predict. You can have one wet year followed by 3 years of drought, followed by 5 years of torrential rain. It's a very mercurial part of the world. It's prone to sudden droughts, which means that people have to be able to move. You have to be semi-mobile if you're going to live in the Sahel. You have to move away from areas that are dry towards areas that are wet. And the dry and the wet areas are totally unpredictable because they depend on these completely, unknown weather patterns. What is a wet place one year can be completely dry the next. What is a dry place one year can be wet for the next 10 years. It's a very, very odd part of the world. It is a very tough part of the world. Living in the Sahel, making a life in the Sahel requires a hard life and hard people. And to meet this demand, to be able to move, like a lot of people in the Sahel, the Nuer rely on two main things. Cattle ranching, supplemented by small-scale growing of millet and corn. They are a pastoralist people, so they primarily depend on cattle. They are into cattle. They're into cattle like the way a few people are into cattle. And they do this in order so that they can be able to move around the Sahel. If a drought hits, they can literally just move their cattle from point A to point B. They can move it from a dry area to a wet area, and they can replant their fields. Millet and corn are pretty tough plants. And so they can survive a small drought. As long as the drought's not too bad, they can survive. But they can just uproot their plants and just move them, again, from A to B. Now, the problem with relying a lot on cattle is that cattle are mobile and cattle can be stolen. And historically, traditionally, societies that rely on pastoralism, societies that rely on cattle ranching, tend to be really, really rough societies, because one of the best ways you can ensure that no one attempts to steal your cattle is just to have just an absolutely terrifying reputation. And cattle raiding is in fact endemic throughout the Sahel. All of these different Sahel groups are almost constantly raiding each other for cattle, because to the Nuer and to a lot of Sahel people, cattle equals wealth. You can put that in your notes. A little cartoon of a cow, an equal sign, and a dollar sign. To the Nuer, like a lot of people in the Sahel, cattle is wealth. Cattle is status. Cattle is a health, and it means your kids are going to have milk tomorrow. Cattle is everything to these people. Cattle is all important. And as we'll see, cattle, you can't even have a family without cattle. The Nuer, there's a Nuer. See, that's a different pattern of gar on his forehead, so he belongs to a different lineage and clan than those women we saw earlier. However, in this very tough land, the Nuer have been remarkably successful. Indeed, they're one of the most successful of any of the groups in the Sahel. Historically, they have fended off both the European empires in the 19th century, these very aggressive Afro-Arab states to their north, largely because they have this very unusual political and social structure. The Nuer do not have a kingdom. The Nuer do not have a president. The Nuer have something that Evans Pritchard called the segmentary lineage. The Nuer have proven themselves capable of surviving devastating wars. They have never lost a war, and are very resilient during these periodic crop failures and droughts of the Sahel. The Nuer are a tough people in a tough land and do very well. In fact, in that picture right there, immediately to my left, that is a very young Evans Pritchard recruiting the Nuer to go fight in the Second World War. So Evans Pritchard is interested in these people. He's interested in these people. They look unusual. They're in a very rough part of the world, and they do very well in this rough part of the world. They're very unique peoples, and this is why Evans Pritchard was so interested in them. Specifically in what made the Nuer so successful in a region of the world where a lot of people really struggle to get by. And this is all the more impressive because, like I mentioned earlier, the Nuer have no government. Just like the Trobriand Islanders, there is no Nuer president, there is no Nuer king. In fact, there never has been. In fact, the Nuer seem to actively hate anything that even smacks of central authority or a central government altogether. In fact, they think the idea of, being submissive and subordinate to a government is absolutely horrifying. No proud people would ever bend the knee to an elected president. That is an alien and bizarre idea to the Nuer. Evans Pritchard came to the conclusion that both the strength and the freedom of the Nuer lies in their unusual system of kinship, a confederated system of families and clans that he termed the segmentary lineage. And the segmentary lineage, here's the formal definition of segmentary lineage. An acephalous socio-political system by which different lineage segments are joined together by established kin relationships and are linked by a common, usually mythical, ancestor. And you can see the guy right up above me, he's got the same pattern of gar as that fellow on the previous slide. So you know that those two guys are A, Nuer, and B, they're related. Because really, everyone in the Nuer is related, and they all know how they're related to each other, because every Nuer family is nested inside a series of other social units. This is a page from Evan Pritchard's own book. And in Evan Pritchard's example, you have 4 different families. You have the Diel, the Mwala, the Quath, and the Mar. So each of these 4 extended families belongs to a sublineage, which is called the Pual. And all of the families of the Pual sublineage are linked together into the Leng lineage. And the Leng lineage combines with the, oh my gosh, I'm going to try to pronounce that, Nyarwak lineage to form the Gatbal subtribe. And the Gatbal subtribe joins with the Rumjak and Galak subtribes to form the Janaka of the Lu tribe. And the Janaka of the Lu tribe joined together with a group of Rangyan lineages to form a sort of super tribal structure, the Janaka of the Lu and Renyak tribes. That would be sort of the overall clan structure. So if I was Nuer and I was giving my entire full name, I would say, I am Keith Mar Pual Leng Gatbal Janaka of Lu, and Renyak. Every Nuer knows how he is related to every other Nuer. It's an incredibly complex and effective system. Now, the important thing is that within each of these different layers, between each of these nested social groups, each group is internally competitive, but externally cooperative. They will raid each other for cattle and women constantly, but then combine together when outsiders threaten them. So if I belong to the Mar family, I might get together with my son or my uncle, and we might raid the Quath family and steal a couple cattle. And we do this constantly. Each of these families is testing the other. I steal a couple cattle today because in a month or so, they're going to try to steal those cattle back. And violence is carefully negotiated within the system. Now, they will raid each other for women, but it tends to be this like very premeditated affair. Like if I've got a daughter and I see that she's making like goo-goo eyes, like a young man from the Quath family, I will quietly go to the Quath family and I'll be like, look, my boy's making goo-goo eyes. No, my daughter's making goo-goo eyes with your boy, and your boy's making goo-goo eyes with my daughter. Can they arrange, to be kidnapped? Because that's how you elope in the Nuer system, or at least as reported in the Nuer system. And violence, and if they're not into each other, then it would be called off before it gets to that stage. And this concept of each of these groups is constantly testing the other. They are internally cooperative. They're internally competitive, but externally cooperative. This is evident, and they have this very elaborate system of duels, in which the type of weapon and the degree of severity of the duel is determined by how closely related the duelists are. Like, say, for instance, I steal these 2 cattle from a nearby family, and they are really upset. That was like his prize-winning stud bull I stole. He is really upset. He's so upset that he's not just going to steal cattle back, but he wants to really teach me a lesson. But he's not just going to hunt me down and shoot me. What it is he's going to complain to the elders, and the elders are going to complain to me or to my elders, and they're going to set up a duel. All right, and what weapons we get to use in this duel, and how severe the duel is, depends on how closely related we are. Brothers will just duel with fists. Members of the same family will sometimes duel with clubs. Members of the same lineage, like these two fellows right up above my head, they are dueling with spears. And again, how closely related these two guys are determines the severity of the duel. It might just be until blood is flowing. It might be till somebody gives up. It might just be till the elders step in and say, no, it's over. You've had your say. And in fact, at the very highest level, different maximal lineages have actually been known to engage in duels with AK-47s. They're each given a couple bullets and shoot at the other person. But that's a very, very severe duel. Now, I showed you the example that Evans Pritchard gave back in the 1940s and 50s. Here is a more sort of modern reconstruction of how the segmentary lineage system works. Right up above me, the lowest level, those are the extended families. The extended families are bound together into minimal segments. The minimal segments are bound together into major segments, into minor segments. The minor segments are bound together into major segments, and the major segments are bound together into a single maximal lineage. And everyone knows how everyone is related to one another because they know when the different families come into intersection. And again, the entire system is internally competitive, but externally cooperative. So the different minimal segments will raid each other for cattle, or they might combine to raid another minor segment, or different groups of the same major segment will raid another part of the major segment of the Nuer people. They are constantly testing one another all the time. And when tempers get too frayed, they go to the dual system. So here we have this segmentary lineage. And now the segmentary lineage system, as opposed to the cooler ring that we talked about, provides a built-in social network for mutual defense, mutual dependence, and protection against famine without making any one lineage subordinate or submissive to any other lineage, and without any kind of centralized leadership or government. It's literally just one family helping out their relatives because they're all related and they all know exactly how closely related they are, even if they haven't intermarried in 1 or 2 or 300 years. So all of these segmentary sections, while remaining competitive, engage in large-scale cooperative behavior, giving them a distinct advantage over these neighboring groups. Some anthropologists have even criticized this segmentary lineage system and emphasized how it is almost this like military-style organization. And they call it, quote unquote, an organization of predatory expansion, because the Nuer have been very, very successful in a very hard land. Now, on the left, we see 3 different patterns of GAR, facial scarification. And again, each one of those extended families, each one of the smallest unit of the segmentary lineage, has a different pattern of GAR. And I want you to think about this. Cogitate. How does the segmentary lineage explain the importance of GAR? How can a cultural practice that seems to us to be completely bizarre and kind of barbaric, but how does it serve a function? How does slicing your face with razor blades function for the Nuer people? Now, I used to show a YouTube clip at this part which shows someone receiving their GAR, but it's tended to squick out a number of people over the years. So I just used this image about how the GAR is created in this young woman who is preparing to get married. The Nuer consider GAR to be a form of beauty. They consider a woman with an intricate system of GAR on her face to be the height of beauty. A man with his family's GAR on his forehead to be the height of being handsome. To them, it's not strange or bizarre at all. And I want you to cogitate on this because I'm going to ask you about it later. What does this cultural practice, what does this cultural structure, what function does it serve for the Nuer? Now, the importance of cattle. Cattle are everything. Cattle are never owned by individuals. Indeed, the Nuer, cattle are actually collectively owned. You have a herd of cattle, they don't belong to me, they belong to my family. All right. Cattle are wealth. Cattle are everything. They're wealth, their status. In fact, you can't even have a family without cattle. And the Nuer will put tremendous time and effort in caring for their herds. It's been said that if you really want to talk to a Nuer, just start talking to them about cattle and they'll talk your ear off. They'll talk for days about this cattle and that cattle and their plans for this herd. And they want to breed this bull with those cows and the calves are really good. They're into cattle like few people are into cattle. And in fact, cattle are traditionally presented as dowry for your bride. You cannot get married without cattle. So, my boy is making goo-goo eyes with your daughter. I've arranged this beforehand, and he's going to come to you, and he's going to say, how many cows is your daughter worth? And you'll set a dowry, 9 bulls, or 3 bulls and 5 cows. And because cattle aren't collectively owned, cattle are never owned by an individual, he's got to come to the family and ask to use those cattle to get married. You can't get married without cattle, and you can't get married. You can't use the cattle without your family's permission. So cattle are collectively owned by the lineage. So to marry, you have to ask permission to use these cattle for marriage. A marriage is essentially then an agreement between 2 different Nuer lineages to exchange cattle for wives. And in fact, women will brag about their dowry. Just like women brag about the size of the ring on their finger, they'll be like, my husband's dowry was 12 cattle. Wow. And then some people roll their eyes. She's just bragging. She's just bragging. But that was the situation that the Nuer had until a major cultural change occurred in the 1980s. So this is the situation in 1983. And that's how the Nuer were successful until about 1983. What happened in 1983 is that the Nuer area was invaded by jihadists from the northern Sudan. Sudan was taken over by a Islamic dictatorship and basically launched an invasion down the Nile River. So the Islamic dictatorship of the Sudan launched a series of attacks on the southern part of the country, largely relying on a combination of mounted irregulars, those guys right there, those guys were called the Janjaweed, backed by government helicopter gunships. And their goal was to launch a jihad into these heathen parts of Africa and to control these oil fields in the south, because all this oil got discovered in southern Sudan. So to control these southern oil fields, to conquer or convert the locals to their very particular brand of Salafist Islam. And this sparked a conflict that was going to last for decades called the Second Sudanese Civil War. Predict the Nuer reaction. The Nuer find they are invaded by outsiders, very brutal and highly aggressive outsiders seeking to push or destroy the Nuer culture, push them off their land, seize their cattle, and convert them to Salafist Islam. What was the Nuer reaction? You've probably already figured it out. Now, this was reported in an excellent ethnography, which was published in 1996, Sharon Hutchinson's The Nuer Dilemmas. And what the Nuer did was basically collectively agree among the entire Nuer people, everyone was going to sacrifice a certain percentage of their cattle. That way no one was any richer or poorer than anyone else. They were all going to sacrifice. They drove enormous herds of cattle across the southern border and sold them. In fact, global beef prices dropped when the Nuer did this. And used the money from the sale of those cattle to buy guns, all right? To purchase large quantities of Russian and Chinese assault rifles. Cattle prices dropped across the continent, and they began to fight. And as the Civil War heated up in earnest, the Nuer culture changed a little bit, and it changed in very interesting ways. And again, think back to what Malinowski says about culture change. Because the Nuer began to build a gun cult around this rifle, the AK-47. The rifle gained this symbolic importance. The rifle gained and acquired many of the roles traditionally held by cattle. As their cattle herds shrank and as their number of guns and rifles increased, this gun cult developed, and the AK-47 began to be treated like they used to treat cattle. So think about this. Guns become the new cattle. So who owns rifles? Individuals do not own AK-47s among the Nuer. The guns are collectively owned. How can wealth now be measured? Well, they do measure wealth in cattle, but now it's also measured in guns. Oh, we have a very wealthy family. We have 800 head of cattle and 180 rifles. Ooh, everyone is very impressed. What implications does this have for dowries? Because the cattle herds shrank and shrank collectively, people didn't want to part with cattle, to pay dowries. So the Nuer began to pay dowries in rifles. Okay, a young Nuer man would see a young new girl. He would make goo-goo eyes at her. She would make goo-goo eyes with him. He would go to his family and says, I want to marry this girl. And they're like, what's the dowry going to be? So he goes to her family, and they don't want to give up cattle. So I think I will give your family 12 AK-47s for the right to marry your daughter. The family agrees, but then because nobody individually owns rifles, he has to go back to his family and say, I need 12 rifles to get married. And they would agree, or they would negotiate, and then the wife would brag about how her husband paid 12 rifles for her, and all of her friends kind of ooh and gasp. That's the gun cult that began to develop around the AK-47. How do you think the war ended? The Nuer and their gun cult and thousands of AK-47 rifles against the Islamic dictatorship to the north with their Janjaweed and helicopter gunships, and a war. The war lasted 28 years and ended with a crushing defeat by the Islamic dictatorship. South Sudan, led primarily by the Nuer, crushed the invading Islamic forces. They defeated the Salafist dictatorship. The Nuer, mark this now, the Nuer organized an army. They built this army. They acquired weapons for this army. They planned and executed strategies for this army without a central government at all. They never had a Nuer king. They never had a Nuer president. Now, they do have this temporary leadership role, something called leopard skin men. It's men who are temporarily given massive amounts of power. And this is the Nuer generals that were fought during the Civil War. But the understanding is when you become a leopard skin man, you have the ability to wear leopard skin. Everyone knows that is temporary. And after a few years, your authority is going to go away. So they appointed these leopard skin generals that led the Nuer soldiers to victory against the dictatorship. And in 2011, South Sudan became the newest country on earth. They broke away from the Sudan, declared their independence, created a new flag, and everyone was absolutely, look how happy that guy is. He's got a whole, he's so happy. They've got their own country. It's not just Nuer. There's like a dozen different ethnicities inside this country in South Sudan. The Nuer are just a big part of this country. Then once they got their independence, once they got their own country in the South Sudan, the Nuer instantly rebelled against their own country. The Nuer promptly rebelled against the government of South Sudan. They constantly worked to undermine and collapse the authority of their own government. And indeed, South Sudan remains one of the weakest governments in the planet. Basically, the government is really only able to exercise authority in the capital of Juba and on a couple highways, and that's absolutely it. The government of South Sudan has almost no authority outside, in the countryside itself. It's barely capable of exercising, collecting taxes or doing anything. Cattle raiding is endemic. The Nuer are constantly making war on their neighbors, primarily an ethnicity called the Dinka. Cattle raiding is endemic, and the country kind of lapses back into sort of semi-controlled anarchy that it has been, for thousands of years. So let's actually summarize what we know about the Nuer people. They're oil rich. There's huge oil in South Sudan. They're oil rich. They own lots of cattle. They're kind of obsessed with cattle. They're heavily armed. They absolutely hate the government. Absolutely hate government completely. They even have cowboy hats. And this is why the Nuer are sometimes called the Texans of Africa. So here's your question. I'm going to ask you this question. How does this cultural structure function to meet the needs of the Nuer? There's their segmentary lineage right there. There's the gar. Why do they wear the gar? How is the gar and the segmentary lineage connected? And does what you've learned about the segmentary lineage of the Nuer, does it refute, support, or modify the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes? How does it do so, and why does it do so? And that's the Nuer. And we're going to continue our discussion of Hobbes as we talk about the Yanomamo of South America, as we talk about the Kachin of Southeast Asia. We're going to do that next time. And I will see you there.